Speaker. Interesting days in the Capitol. And I'll keep being asked about the metal detector. I was not happy about metal detectors, but for some weeks now I've been complying, taking my stuff out, putting it on the table, going through the metal detector. And I did that yesterday and came in here, and I was going to be recognized to speak. Since the restroom is just right there through that door, you see it as you're standing there at the door. I did what I've done for a number of weeks now, went to the restroom and came back. Since the officers see you and there was nobody else in the area, as there usually isn't these days, went in, came out, and so people know. And like The Godfather, there's no tanks on the toilets, no place to hide a gun that I've seen. But anyway, the officers see you, and no one has ever said a word about needing to be re-examined when you're just right there. And anyway, apparently rules have changed over the last few weeks, and all of a sudden yesterday I was told, well, you need to be wanted. I said, I know I've been through the metal detector, and this has never been required before. So I came in. Today I get a notice that I'm supposed to be fined $5,000. So the things is not supposed to happen is arbitrary and capriciousness. And to go for a number of weeks and nobody ever say a word because you're just going right there and back, never having to be re-examined, and then all of a sudden yesterday and today be hit with a $5,000 fine. So I just, Mr. Speaker, want to make sure our colleagues know that it's the metal detectors are not the issue entirely. You may want to use facilities at your office or around your office, because now, despite the admonition in the Constitution itself about not stopping or detaining a member of Congress on his way into a session, it's in the Constitution. The Speaker has seen fit to defy that, to create metal detectors. And now that's not enough. You can't even go to the restroom in full view of the officers without being hit upon and unconstitutionally treated again. I've been going along with unconstitutional action anyway, but it seems that it's one of those things, no matter how much you finally are desensitized to the Constitution enough to comply with unconstitutional actions, there just keeps being another requirement. So we will see how it all comes out, but hopefully other members will learn from the arbitrariness of my treatment to avoid that for themselves. On Fox News, my friend Tucker Carlson had touched on yesterday that, and this article is by Tucker, there's been an enormous amount of talk, not just this week, but over the last month, about violent extremism and the people who embrace it. Those people, we're told, are domestic terrorists who must be put down by force. The war on terror has moved stateside. Extremists are inside our country, and we must hunt them down. We're hearing those words nonstop, not just on cable news, but from elected officials, including some Republicans. We're hearing it from the leaders of federal law enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies. We're hearing it from the Pentagon. Just this week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the entire U.S. military to stand down while investigators cleanse the ranks of political extremists. And of course, we're hearing it from the business establishment, from Wall Street, from tech monopolies, from the massive multinational corporations that increasingly control the contours of American life. All of them are now on the hunt for political extremists. And by the way, with regard to the effort to purge the military of anybody with a political position that does not support socialism, my 4 years at Fort Benning, Georgia, about half of that under Commander-in-Chief Carter, and the other, about half, under Commander-in-Chief Reagan. There were a lot of people at Fort Benning that didn't care for what was happening to the military under President Carter. But we knew you could not say anything derogatory about the Commander-in-Chief without being either punished with an Article 15 non-judicial punishment or being prosecuted because he was the Commander-in-Chief. But everybody, Democrat, Republican, or now lots of socialists, as long as you did your job in the military, you followed orders, you didn't have any problem. But we were not heard to talk about the terrible morale under President Carter, the way we were no longer respected, the way internationally, especially after the failed hostage rescue attempt that I believe had more to do with civilian oversight restrictions than it was anything else. I was told by people at Fort Benning that the president, the White House, was warned, if you make us go in with so few helicopters, there's a good chance we won't have the 6 needed in order to go rescue the hostages. We knew where they were, and that they were made to scale to 8. So when they lost 3 on the way to the staging area, then it was an automatic abort, according to one of my friends that was part of it. And anyway, we ended up losing a chopper with military on board, a C-130 with military on board. But still, we didn't go out. You didn't hear us trashing the Carter White House because we were in the military. Our political opinions didn't matter, even if people had contempt for the poor leadership in the White House. Didn't say it because it was not allowed. And people, despite their political positions, were ready to lay down their lives for their country if that was necessary. Some did. Even though that's a time of peace, those 4 years I was in, we were never in a declared police action or war. Still, we did our jobs, no matter what it was, and nobody was run out of the military for their political positions. But now, under this administration, things have changed. And as Tucker Carlson goes on, he says you have to be more precise. You have to, in order to root out a problem, you have to know what the problem is. You need a sense of what you're looking for, a clear picture. You have to define the terms. The remarkable thing about this conversation we're having is that no one is doing that. Have you noticed that none of these newly energized and high-powered extremist hunters have told us exactly what an extremist is? We're left to guess, to look around nervously to see if we can spot one. They're not talking about us, are they? And if they are, what exactly are they doing? How are they hunting these extremists they keep telling us about but will not describe? We now know part of the answer to that question. And he points out Tucker Carlson tonight has exclusively obtained evidence that Bank of America, the second largest bank in the country with more than 60 million customers, is actively but secretly engaged in the hunt for extremists in cooperation with the government. Bank of America is without the knowledge or consent of its customers, sharing private information with federal law enforcement agencies. Bank of America effectively is acting as an intelligence agency, but they're not telling you about it. In the days after January 6th riot at the Capitol, Bank of America went through its own customers' financial and transaction records. These were the private records of Americans who had committed no crime. People, as far as we know, had absolutely nothing to do with what happened at the Capitol. But at the request of federal investigators, Bank of America searched its databases looking for people who fit a specific profile. Here's what that profile was. Number one, customers confirmed as transacting either through bank account debit or credit card purchases in Washington, D.C. between January 5th and January 6th. Number two, purchases made for a hotel, Airbnb, in D.C., Virginia, Maryland after January 6th. Any purchase of weapons or at a weapons-related merchant between January 7th and their upcoming suspected stay in the D.C. area around Inauguration Day, and also airline-related purchases since January 6th. The first thing you should notice about the profile is that it's remarkably broad. Any purchases of anything in Washington, D.C., any overnight stay anywhere in an area spanning 3 jurisdictions and hundreds of miles, any purchase, not just of legal firearms, but anything bought from a weapons-related merchant, T-shirts included, and any airline-related purchases, not just flights to Washington, but flights to anywhere, from Omaha to Thailand. That is an absurdly wide net. Bank of America identified a total of 211 customers who met these thresholds of interest. At that point, Tucker Carlson tonight has learned Bank of America turned over the results of its internal scan to federal authorities, apparently without notifying the customers who were being spied upon. Federal investigators then interviewed at least one of these unsuspecting people. That person, we've learned, hadn't done anything wrong and was cleared. Imagine if you're that person. The FBI hauls you in for questioning in a terror investigation, not because you've done anything wrong or suspicious, but because you bought plane tickets, visited your country's capital. Now they're sweating you because your bank, which you trust with your most private information, has ratted you out without your knowledge. Because Bank of America did that, you're being treated like a member of Al-Qaeda. It doesn't matter how much you despise Donald Trump or how much you believe that hatred of Trump justifies suspending this country's ancient civil liberties. Going through that experience would scare the heck out of you. Does anyone else know about this? Is there a record of this interview? Will I lose my job because of it? That actually happened to someone. Anyway, he goes on and points out this issue of banks toting over information, and it took me back in time to the George W. Bush presidency when I first got to Congress, and I first learned about something called national security letters. That was a shock to me to find out about what were called NSLs, national security letters, because I've been a litigant, I've been a felony judge and a chief justice, and I was quite familiar with reviewing affidavits in support of requests for warrants, and I've reviewed them at all hours of the day and night. Most of the time, because law enforcement in my jurisdiction was told by the DA they needed to go through the DA's office to make sure that the warrants met the constitutional requirements. So it was rare, but sometimes I did say, you don't have facts that create probable cause to believe a crime has been committed or probable cause to believe this person committed it. We need some facts here that you can swear to under oath that will allow me to sign a warrant so that places may be searched and specific things described with particularity can be seized. So, having had that history, I was quite surprised to find that under the Patriot Act, and actually this little note is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Not really familiar with them, but they've got a good synopsis on national security letters, that these NSLs currently authorized by 4 federal statutes: the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the National Security Act, the Right to Financial Privacy Act, which is kind of ironic. They don't need probable cause to get your records under the Financial Privacy Act. That's amazing. Fair Credit Reporting Act, and also the USA Patriot Act. So the way they work, and this article describes it pretty well, although there are procedures for review after they are issued. National security letters can be issued by the FBI without any judicial oversight. The FBI must certify that the records sought are, quote, relevant to an authorized investigation to protect against international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, unquote. We were assured during the reauthorization of the Patriot Act that this was only used to go against or to investigate foreigners who were either part of a known terrorist organization, were known terrorists themselves, or had relations with a known foreign terrorist organization. I'd asked in one of our meetings with Justice Department people, but what about the other reason you can send out a national security letter and just siphon up all of somebody's records from a third party, and that's called clandestine intelligence activities? And I was told, oh, no, we don't really use that. I said, well, I'd like to know what that means. Clandestine intelligence activities, does that mean if my next door neighbor is kind of hiding behind the curtain and watching what's going on at my house, that's clandestine? They're seeking intelligence with what's happening next door. That mean you can scoop up all their records? And the answer was basically, no, we don't really use that part. Well, that was so vague, it bothered me, but our chairman at the time was a great man, Jim Sensenbrenner, but he was not about to allow any changes to that. So it's still there, 15, 16 years later, and we kept being assured by everybody there are never any abuses to the national security letter, but it concerned me because if all it took was an FBI agent just signing something saying, I need this for investigation, who's to be sure it really does? I kind of like the warrant system where you got to go to a judge and establish, with particularity, the person to be seized or the things to be seized or the place to be searched. I remember when I was an assistant DA, we had kind of an interesting deputy that people would kind of roll their eyes about. And he was constantly coming in asking for a warrant. And as assistant DA, I got to know him, and nice guy, but he came in once and said, I know I've been harassing you, trying to get a warrant. I know there's people smoking dope out in this little big community, but they have a little bitty store there, and I found out the people I think are smoking dope are going to have a party Friday night, and I've got good authority. They're going to have potato chips there. And that little store was just recently burglarized late at night, and one of the things they took was potato chips. So I want to get a warrant to go in these people's home looking for potato chips, and then I'll look for the dope while I'm there. And I said, well, is there any way to identify the potato chips that were in this store that were stolen? No, but see, that's the beauty. While I'm looking for potato chips, I'll just kind of look around for dope. I said, that's not adequate to establish probable cause to go busting into somebody's house looking for potato chips. If you can't identify, they came and they were the ones that were stolen. And anyway, he was very upset that I wouldn't draft up the application for warrant, his affidavit, because he thought he had a great way to do it. Well, what I didn't know back then was that there'd be federal statutes after 9/11 established. You don't need to go get a judge to say, yes, there's probable cause to believe crime was committed and this person did it, or probable cause to believe that you could find the fruits of a crime at a particular described location. No, you just have an FBI agent send a national security letter saying, I'm investigating a matter and I need you to give me all the records you have on a certain individual or a certain business. And by the way, under this NSL law, if you tell anybody that you got this demand for records, then you will have committed a felony and we'll prosecute you. Now, back then, it didn't say you could even tell your lawyer, but the President George W. Bush administration, Justice Department said, but we're interpreting it to mean that somebody that receives a national security letter demand for production can talk to their lawyer. We won't prosecute anybody for talking to their own lawyer. Well, wasn't that generous? But we were assured, both privately in meetings and under testimony, that there were no known violations of the law on national security letters. Is always to go after foreign terrorists or people that associated with foreign terrorist groups. That's what we're doing. It still was a concern. That just seems like so much power. And eventually it was included that, you had to get a higher up approval before you sent out the national security letter. But the Attorney General at the time, really good, decent guy, Alberto Gonzales, and he had indicated, he was not aware of any known violations of the law under the National Security Letter, the NSL laws. And unfortunately for him, he testified before, and I don't have any of the information. I'm just going off my institutional memory from those days, that he had testified before the Senate, a Senate committee, that there were no known violations of the law on national security letters. Well, unfortunately for him, there was a DOJ Inspector General report, as I recall, had been on his desk for 3 days, and the IG said there may be more than 3,000, or many as 3,000, violations of the law in gathering information under national security letters, where FBI agents just wanted to find out about somebody, some business, so they sent a letter demanding records about the person or the business, saying, give me all you got on this person or business, when there was not a case, there was not probable cause of anything, there was not a known terrorist involved or known terrorist organization. They just wanted information about somebody, something, and so sent them out. And I'd seen that Mr. Schumer, Senator Schumer, was really upset. He felt like they had been lied to when he found out that there had been an IG report 3 days before that the Attorney General had, when he said there were no known violations. And I ran into Senator Schumer here on the Hill. I think it was the next day, within a couple of days. And I said, I saw you had our Attorney General give him a hard time about the violations of the National Security Letter. That's something I've been upset about. And then to find out there may have been more than 3,000 violations with just fishing expeditions. And he said some things that were not complimentary about the head of the Justice Department. And he said, I don't know why the president doesn't just, let him go and hire somebody else. I said, well, I can tell you why he doesn't. And that's because we figure you would not allow a new appointee to get through the committee, and we don't need to go. I think there's a year and a half left without a real Attorney General. And he said, no, look, there are people I know we could agree on if they would just try, but he felt like we needed a new Attorney General. Well, the thing is, the FBI director at that time was a guy named Mueller. And it was really a problem that should have fallen directly at the feet of Director Mueller. It's his FBI. He could have supervised them more thoroughly, especially when we're talking about thousands of abuses of people's rights and abuses of the National Security Letter use, seizing people's information, personal as it is. But I thought about all of that when I'm seeing that Bank of America had turned over all this information to the federal authorities, the FBI, I guess. And it made me wonder if maybe they were back to their old ways of abusing the NSLs, and no probable cause that a particular person committed a crime at all, just on fishing expeditions. I wondered if maybe they used the NSLs to go on those fishing expeditions and caught lots of honest, innocent Americans in their net. Now, going back to that, when I first got here, we had a lot of friends on the Democrat side of the aisle that were extremely concerned about civil rights, and just like Senator Schumer was extremely upset to find out the FBI had violated potentially thousands of people's basic civil rights, seizing information about them without having any probable cause, violating the Fourth Amendment and possibly Fifth. But that was a different time. In fact, I was concerned, and I called the White House asking for the chief of staff. It was Josh Bolton at the time, and I felt like he was a really good, decent guy. And he was in a meeting with President Bush at the time, but he called me back. And I told him about the concerns that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle are upset that our Republican administration was abusing people's rights like that, just using national security letters willy-nilly, and, that we needed some change. And they couldn't do it unless they knew they had an agreement to get through somebody else. What I should have done, I made a mistake. I should have been demanding that Mueller go and get a different FBI director. But anyway, I suggested somebody that could talk friendly with Senator Schumer, give him a call, and see if they couldn't agree on some replacements. And anyway, we ended up with Attorney General Mukasey. I felt like he was a very honorable man. I had nothing to do with who was picked, but apparently there was an agreement between the White House and Senator Schumer and others potentially. But all of that came back to mind as I saw that a bank, I think it's the second biggest in the country, was turning over information without apparently getting any warrant. But really, it's a problem of the national security letter. And I've heard, we got into discussion back at reauthorization, heard from the Department of Justice saying, look, this is such an important tool. I'm going, but it's so easily abused. There's got to be more checks and balances here. And back at the time, Democrats on the Judiciary Committee here in the House were concerned, but there were not enough of us concerned to completely, radically change the national security letter laws or to do away with it. So they're still around all these years later. And I'm hoping that we can get some people on both sides of the aisle. Democrats are in the majority. I would love to see a hearing where we could get down to it. If it needs to be under classified conditions, closed, whatever. But we really need to take another look at this, because it could just completely depend on the administration. And I would hope that maybe with as much hatred as some people have for former President Trump, maybe the thought that, gee, what if he got reelected? Then he could put people in place that use those national security letters to go after all the people he didn't like. Maybe that would be enough to encourage people who hate former President Trump to actually take some action to really try to secure people's civil rights that have been violated for years. And all under the guise that, we're protecting ourselves from either international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, whatever that is. So anyway, that came back to mind. It's still something that should be done. Uh, there's a story here my staff was able to find from the New York Times back in 2007 when they were a little more trustworthy. But it talks, it's entitled FBI Head Admits Mistakes in Use of Security Act. And that was Mr. Mueller. He embraced the responsibility for the lapses, but he was punished by giving him 2 extra years as the director of the FBI. That allowed him to continue the poor supervision that allowed these kind of what he called lapses. In this article, it says, quote, "How could this happen," unquote. Mr. Mueller asked rhetorically in a briefing at the headquarters of the FBI, quote, "Who is to be held accountable?" And the answer to that is, "I am to be held accountable," unquote. But the truth is, he was never held accountable. In fact, he was actually rewarded. And Attorney General Gonzalez paid the price for his huge failure. So that is rather tragic. That's something I'm hoping that we could work together on, Democrats and Republicans, because civil rights, it appears, are being trampled once again. I don't know if there was a pause in the trampling, but regardless, we need to be doing some serious oversight. Now, I have an article here from Yale Helon. Said DeSantis bracing for a big fight over big tech crackdown. We're buckled up, he said. And that is another area where it's not the government that is abusing people's rights, but it's the high tech. And I recently reread George Orwell's 1984, and as I understand, I believe it was 1947 that he wrote it. He was dying, as I understand, cancer. He'd gone, I believe it was to Scotland. He had been through some treatment that was pretty rough, so some think that may have helped him with imagination on how people could be tortured. But incredible. I mean, in the late 40s, there were very, very few televisions around. And I know where I grew up in East Texas, there were hardly any at all. Even up until 1953, there were very few. But here it is, right after World War II, and George Orwell is talking about this big brother. Of course, under the rules of the House, we're not supposed to talk about brothers, but this big sibling, I believe is the word we're supposed to use. So, big sibling watched and listened to everything everybody did, and they would use a telescreen, which back then, there were no flat screen TVs, but that's what's conjured up when you think about a telescreen. Televisions were rare, and this guy already is imagining that someday the government will be watching you through this big screen. And nowadays, that's your phone, that's your computer. And I know I'd heard from an intelligence friend that, they could watch people through their camera on their computer. And so I started putting a little sticky note on my computer. And one day at Judiciary Committee, the head of the FBI came in, and I noticed he had a little sticky note over the camera on his computer. And I thought, well, he knows what they can do. And if he's putting a sticky note over his camera, maybe he doesn't want to be watched by a big sibling either. But anyway, now the big tech industry can watch everything you do, everything you look up. They can listen to you. We had our IT helper come in, and I just don't like the idea that somebody, whether in high tech or government, could be watching or listening when there's no crime that's been committed. But I asked the IT guy, I said, can you take Siri off of my stuff? And I just hate Siri. And Siri's voice came up and said, that's not nice. Whoa, I'd just as soon not have Siri, Alexa, anybody watching and listening to everything's going on. No crimes being committed. It's not a crime to go to the bathroom here, even though I'm being fined $5,000 for it. Hopefully that'll be corrected. But that's just a little unnerving. And yet George Orwell foresaw that this big sibling would be out there someday watching and listening. So I really appreciate my old representative, congressman friend, Ron DeSantis, as governor of Florida. This article says he took aim Tuesday at the country's largest technology companies, and which he characterized as a group of monopoly communications platforms based on how they have grown to regulate public discourse. DeSantis announced a crackdown on tech companies over content moderation, which he equated to political manipulation, reiterating a belief held by many conservatives that Silicon Valley is biased and against right-leaning viewpoints. And parenthetically here, an article in Time magazine by Molly Ball, The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. And of course she characterizes, well, I say she, I don't know, Molly may be a guy, but characterizes what went on as being justified, but try to save the election for then Senator Biden. And it's quite interesting, but it's there's no question there was tremendous manipulation of information by the high-tech industry, even though that person, Molly, has a different perspective. But Governor DeSantis said, we think this is something that Floridians want protection from. I think it will end up being a really good first step, he told Tucker Carlson tonight on Tuesday. There's always been the question, what do you do about this? A lot of us have thought there was something wrong for a long time, but to sit back and hope it gets better. That clearly wasn't going to work, so we're leading, and I think it will be good. Governor DeSantis says, the article says, in an effort to keep big tech out of Florida's political sphere, DeSantis proposed a number of measures, including a $100,000 daily fine, not for going to the restroom right off the floor, but for companies that deplatform political candidates. Additionally, actions taken by companies to effectively promote a candidate will be considered campaign contributions. The governor proposed measures to enhance user rights as well, including allowing individuals and the Florida Attorney General to sue companies over violations of individual protections, as well as requiring companies to provide full disclosures of actions taken against individuals for violating policies. Quote, it's not just being banned from Twitter. As we've seen, these companies can collude. They can deny you, if you're a small business, payment processing, the ability to use email and text. So you go to a rally that they don't like, or you engage in wrong think, and all of a sudden your flower business is decapitated for a month because they take action. The Republican acknowledged that the initiative will likely cause a big fight in the legislative session. Hopefully, we can get a lot of support. Most folks don't want or do want protections for their privacy and their data. Most folks want protection from being deplatformed. I think it will be very positively received, but we're buckled up. We know there are always fights over these things, so stay tuned. So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, I'm sure some would want to blame it on conservatives or Republicans, but this report out from Mara Chastain that the 2020 homicide rate is so high there is no modern precedent. But if you look at what brought about the 2020 homicide rate so high there's no modern precedent, we're talking about the groups that have been protesting, looting, even though the lamestream media calls it mostly peaceful, the looting, the killing, the brutalizing, the fires, the trying to burn and kill police in their own station. Those things have gone on, and until the Capitol was invaded, which is totally wrong, doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, Socialist, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's wrong. And despite my quoting the speaker, her comment about surprise or not riots in the street across the country, I do not advocate for violence. Never have. Don't advocate for violence. As a historian, and I never quit studying history, reading, finding out more, it's very clear that some things do help trigger violence. And just as if you seal a heating pressure cooker, it's going to create a terrible reaction. And as I've pointed out before, we have, in this country, we created courts, and in some cases it's the legislative job, but to resolve disputes civilly, and that normally avoids violence. Now, sometimes we have violence erupt in courtrooms. That happens. But as I've told people in my courtroom, the courts often are the last civil bastion where we work things out. No violence. We punish people for violence. But this is where we come to civilly resolve disputes. And when you have courts repeatedly refuse to even have a hearing, take evidence, and resolve disputes, it does create problems. And I don't want those problems. I don't want violence from anybody. And that's how we safely, the odds are you increase chances of not having violence when our institutions, constitutionally created to resolve disputes civilly, do that. And I hope that's what we'll do here, and do a better job of it than has been done. But it used to be, during the Revolution, one of the most common expressions, often attributed to Voltaire. I've read some places that maybe somebody said it before Voltaire, but that is the line that founders often said: I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And now we've come to a place in America where people feel like, well, I disagree with what you say, so I hate you, I hate your family, I'm going to try to get you fired, and I hope we can get you put in jail, and I hope your children die and never get a job and can't take care of themselves. I mean, it's gotten really vicious some places in this country. And I was raised in a family, meals were pretty lively, because everybody was fairly intelligent, and we had some very heated discussions. But we still loved each other. And I mean, there are people in this body that I really love them. You know, I think they're wrong about really critical issues, but we can come in here and argue and debate and fuss. And in here, since I've been here, maybe one time, different, but when people in here say, we're going to fight this, they're not talking about violence. They're talking about debate. That's what I'm talking about. But we need to get back to the institutions designed under federal and state constitution to resolve disputes civilly. And that one of the problems with this whole Russia hoax, you know, the guy that was slam dunk guilty of fraud upon the FISA court and of lying under oath was just allowed to plead and get probation. And I said when the article came out, I think it was December of 2019, that Kleinsmith had changed the information to help them, what amounted to be illegally, get a warrant against somebody in the Trump campaign. I said, oh, I hope they're not going to use him as the scapegoat when there's so many in the DOJ or FBI that lied under oath. They committed what certainly appear to be crimes. And we'll see. Durham entirely dropped the ball. That information should have been out long ago so people would know what was true and not have to rely on big tech to lie to them or manipulate them. But they dropped the ball. And so it appears to many people that there's a double standard when it comes to justice. If you're a part of the DOJ, FBI, intelligence, and you favor Democrats, it appears you get a better deal. But we will see. This is Friday. And Mr. Speaker, I know it's Friday, and I'm told I'm the last speaker of the day. You've been immensely gracious, and I hope you have a good weekend, but I do yield back at this time.